Hello everyone, Void here. Hope everyone is healthy and safe. In this video, I'll be talking about starter frames, or the 3 Warframes that you'll be presented to pick from when starting the game. If you clicked on this video, I assume that you are a new player, jumping into Warframe, or perhaps someone who is still deciding whether to play this game. If that is you, I recommend that you check out my previous videos if you haven't already. I'll link them in the cards now. So, starter frames. You just launched the game and you are presented with 3 choices of Warframes to pick from. And you are clueless which is the best frame to start with. If you want a TLDR of this video, I would just recommend that you go with any of them that suit your playstyle and preference. There's no wrong choice. Although most veteran players in the community would suggest picking Excalibur as your starter frame, I can understand why, but I would personally pick Mag instead if I were to start a new account. I'll get to that in the later part of the video. But in this video, I'll be telling you a few things about starter frames, which is Excalibur, Mag, and Volt, that you might want to know that could affect your choice. First, let's go over the abilities of each starter frame to give you a better idea of how each of them work in their playstyle. First up is Excalibur, a swordsman type or a knight, whichever you want to think of it as. But don't let the theme of this Warframe fool you. Any Warframe in the game can use a melee weapon of any type. The reason Excalibur adopts the name of a legendary sword is because of his ultimate skill that takes a form of an energy sword. I will get to that in a moment, but for now, let's go over each skill one by one. He has a passive that increases his damage and attack speed by 10% when wielding swords. First skill is Slash Dash. Dash between enemies while slashing with the Exalted Blade. Ability unlocked at rank 0, which means you have this skill right away. Cost 25 energy, range of 12 meters and 250 physical damage. At rank 0, your Excalibur will have 100 energy, which increases as you rank up. But energy in this game does not regenerate passively, not unless you have a specific mod, or when you pick up an energy orb. Energy orbs regenerate 25 energy, so as you can tell, you can't spam abilities recklessly as you will run out of energy very quickly. Later in the game, you could farm for mods to upgrade your Warframe and allow you to spam them more freely. But as a beginner, you're not going to have access to that anytime soon. Second ability is Radial Blind. Unlocked at rank 3, it emits a bright flash of light, blinding all enemies in a small radius for several seconds. Costs 50 energy, blinds in a 25 meter radius for 50 seconds. This seems useful for the early game, but bear in mind that 25 meters is not really far. Furthermore, crowd control is not really valued in this game. The whole meta of Warframe is to eliminate as many enemies as possible within the least amount of time as possible. Next is Radial Javelin. Unlocks at rank 5, launches javelins towards enemies, dealing high damage and impaling them to walls. Costs 75 energy, launches 12 javelins damaging enemies in a 25 meter radius for 1000 damage. Pretty costly for a small radius AoE damage. Although 1000 damage is pretty decent early game, it is mediocre and ineffective in the late game, even with the best ability strength mods equipped, but impaling enemy aliens can be cool though. Finally, Excalibur's signature ability, the Exalted Blade. Unlocked at rank 10, like all other Warframes, summon a sword of light and immense power. Cost 25 upon activation and 2.5 energy per second while it's active. What this does is create an energy sword that is completely separate from the melee weapon that you equip and use it like a lightsaber that can shoot sonic booms on each swing. This is what veteran players will be using 90% of the time when playing Excalibur. It is powerful because the Exalted Blade can be modded as well to be more effective against high level enemies. It is the range projectile feature that makes Excalibur's melee stand out compared to regular melee weapons. Otherwise, besides that, everything else the Exalted Blade can do, other regular melee weapons can as well. Next Warframe is Mag. You can think of her as the Magneto of Warframe. She uses her power of magnetism like a psychic and can manipulate enemies and even bullets to her advantage. It takes a while to understand how her ability works and the synergy between them, but I would argue her abilities would make her a better option for the early game. Her passive is bullet jumping pulls in nearby items for easy collection. So this is a minor convenience passive ability, but later in the game when your companion does it for you, it becomes redundant. Her first ability is Pull. Available immediately from rank 0, Magnetic Force pulls enemies towards you, stunning them and bringing them into melee range. Costs 25 energy with a 25 meter range. Bear in mind that the range affects only where you aim at in a V-shaped area of effect. So enemies in around a 60-degree angle will be put towards you, take magnetic damage, and will be ragdolled for a short period of time. The drop chance in the description indicates the drop chance of energy orbs pulled out of enemies upon use. You can increase the drop chance with higher ability strength mods, but I don't think this is an important feature you need to worry about too much. Second ability is Magnetize. Unlocked at rank 3, creates a magnetic field around a target, ensnaring nearby enemies and dealing damage over time. The field reacts to bullets and shards created from Polarize to increase the damage. Costs 50 energy, and what this does is turn a target into a magnet of sort. It stuns the target and creates an orb around it, indicating the range where the enemies will get pulled into. It also attracts bullets both enemy and your allies. So as long as you shoot at the orb, even if you do not aim directly at the center of the target, your bullets will curve and hit it at the center. And when the magnetized orb duration ends, it explodes in a larger radius for a little bit of damage. You can have only up to 3 magnetized bubbles up at a time. So when you cast a 4th bubble, the oldest one will explode prematurely, so use that to your advantage. Next is Polarize. Unlocks at rank 5, emit an energy pulse that depletes enemy shields and armor, creating shards which become deadly when mixed with Magnetize. Shields of allies touched by the pulse are restored. Costs 75 energy. It says a radius of 8 meters, but it's actually an expanding pulse wave that travels 8 meters per second over the duration of 5 seconds, and deals a little bit of magnetic damage. So essentially, it is a pulse that expands over a period of time, that when it touches an enemy, a portion of its shields or armor will be stripped away and turned into shards. It has synergy with the Magnetize ability, whereby the shards that's supposed to fall off get pulled into the magnetic bubble and continue to damage enemies within it. It may sound powerful at first, but as you rank up into the late game, this ability starts to become less effective. Last skill is Crush. Unlocked at rank 10, magnetizes the bones of nearby enemies, causing them to collapse upon themselves. Costs an expensive 100 energy, deals a lot of magnetic damage over a 18 meter radius, and deals a knockdown effect for a brief amount of time. The shield per hit stat is the amount of shields you regenerate from each take of damage for each enemy affected. So as you can tell, this is basically the nuke ability of Mag. It's powerful against low level enemies. It can basically one-shot a large area of the map around you if modded well. But because it deals only magnetic damage, it's weaker against higher level enemies because that's when you need to start worrying about elemental damage weaknesses and resistances. And last but not least, Volt. You can think of him as a crossover of The Flash and Storm from the X-Men. Volt, as the name suggests, is an electric or lightning themed Warframe. He is used quite a lot in the endgame because of his utility, almost as if he is the jack of all trade type, and his ability kit is pretty simple to understand. But most of his abilities will only be useful when fully equipped with upgraded mods, which as a beginner you are not going to have right now. His passive allows him to build up a sort of static charge that gives 5 electric damage per meter of running, up to a maximum of 1000 damage. That damage you accumulate would be discharged in the next attack you make, whether it is with your next bullet, melee hit, or ability attack. Volt's first ability is Shock. Launches a shocking projectile. It stuns and deals high damage to a single target and chains damage to nearby enemies. Costs 25 energy, can chain its damage up to 5 enemies within 15 meters of each other. It's your typical lightning bolt ability. Stuns enemies very briefly, and after its initial damage, it does a little bit of damage over time. But the high damage part is a lie. Because it only does electric damage, even with the best mods equipped, the damage it deals to high level enemies is pathetic. It works fine in the beginning with low levels even without mods, but not for long. Second ability is Speed. Gain a brief boost of movement speed which affects all allies in range. If you want to run like the Flash, you cast this ability. Costs 25 energy. The radius is how far you can buff your allies with this ability. Buff duration of 5 seconds, which can be improved with mods up to 30 seconds. Speed multiplier is how fast you can sprint, and it can buff your weapon, reload speed, and melee attack speed as well. You can recast this while the buff is active to refresh the duration. A little downside is that you can't turn this buff off if you want to, and you'll have to wait till the duration is over. At least the buff doesn't last too long. Third is Electric Shield. Volt deploys an obstacle of energy, providing cover in any situation. Costs 50 energy, lasts for 25 seconds and gives your projectiles 50% more electric damage, and also 200% critical damage, which is not shown here. It's a practically invincible shield that lasts however long you mod it for. It protects you from enemy fire, but you can still walk through and shoot through it. You can have up to max of 6 shields up at any time, which means you can basically set up a mini fortress for a short time if you have the energy to cast it. Veteran Volt players usually stack multiple shields together to buff up the damage when shooting through the shield. This is particularly useful when damaging bosses like Eidolons. You can also pick up a shield and move around with it, but you'll be limited to only use your secondary and melee weapon, since you need both hands to hold your primary weapon. And finally, the last ability is Discharge. Paralyze nearby hostiles with a damaging electric charge. This also shocks approaching enemies. This is Volt's nuke ability. It costs 100 energy, affects enemies in a radius of 20 meters, effect radius of 8 meters, which is the range of the damage over time AoE. Discharge works by blasting a pulse that deals initial damage to enemies around it, and then debuffs them with a stun and a static charge that electrocutes other enemies around each other, dealing damage over time. The longer the duration, the longer the damage over time and stun effect lasts. What's also powerful about Discharge is that the pulse can affect enemies through walls. So it is true to its nuking capabilities, but the damage it deals depends on the enemies being clustered together. If they are far apart from each other, Discharge won't deal as much damage as it could. Now that we've gone through understanding each of the starter frame's abilities, let's look at their base stats. Because as a new player, you are going to be starting with no mods and all you have are your stats in health, armor, shield, and energy. The table here is the stat comparison of Excalibur, Mag, and Volt. From this stat table, you can see why most players in the community would recommend new players to pick Excalibur. He has the highest amount of health and armor to help with survivability, whereby Mag has better stats in shields and energy pool. But I would make the argument, however, that in my personal opinion, I will pick shields as a survivability stat. The reason is simple, you don't have mods. In Warframe, shields can recharge itself after a few seconds of not taking damage, but health cannot regenerate, not passively at least. To regenerate health, you need to pick up red orbs that drop from enemies or containers. But the drop rates of these health orbs are rare and unreliable, especially during low levels. Other ways to regenerate health is through either a different Warframe ability or with mods like Mediray, Healing Return, or Arcane Grace, which you don't have. And it will be a while before you can find any one of these. Having high armor is great, but armor can only mitigate damage on health, not shields. Shields now will always provide a passive fixed 25% damage mitigation. Excalibur's 225 armor value gives a 42.86% damage mitigation, while Mag and Volt's 100 armor gives only 25% damage mitigation. But remember, armor does not improve shield damage mitigation, only health, and health does not regenerate. Shields will serve you well in survivability against two of the three main factions, the Grineer and Corpus. If you pick Mag, you may have some trouble against the Infested because a good number of its enemy type uses Toxin element attacks. And Toxin damage can bypass your shields, which can be dangerous. So if you are up against an Infested mission, stay away from these guys and shoot them from afar. Mag has the largest amount of energy reserve, which allows you to use abilities more often. On top of the fact that her first ability pool can generate more energy orbs at random, effectively replenishing itself. Now let's talk about obtainability. Warframes are more like equipment that you can change on the fly outside of a mission, rather than a character change in other online RPGs. If you are a new player, you might be wondering if whichever you pick, can you get the other two starter frames as well? Yes, you can. As with all other Warframes, you can farm for them without using real money or the premium currency Platinum. This factor could affect your decision on which starter frame you should pick to ease the grind, and that is a fair question. We'll go over each of them. To farm for Excalibur, you get the main blueprints from the market. It costs 35,000 credits, which is the in-game currency you can farm. And then you'll need to farm for the three main blueprint parts that are required, the same for all Warframe crafting: the chassis, neuroptics, and systems. For Excalibur, all three of them can be farmed from a mini-boss called Lieutenant Lack Krill in War on Mars. It's not too far from the planet you start in, so you can get there soon enough. Complete the assassination mission and you are guaranteed one of the three blueprint parts for Excalibur at random. Farm until you have one of each and you may begin crafting Excalibur in the foundry. One problem, however, is that Lieutenant Lack Krill is a pain to deal with. You may want to open the mission for the public to join and make the run easier. To get Mag, it is the same process but on a different planet. You get Mag's main blueprint from the market for 25,000 credits. The three parts for Mag is dropped from another mini-boss called the Sergeant in Iliad on Phobos. He is a much easier boss, which you should be able to solo quite easily. Farm him until you get all three parts and you can craft Mag in the foundry. And lastly, for Volt, it is a little different, and this might push you to pick Volt over the other two. Volt cannot be farmed from a boss drop. To get Volt, you need to be in a clan that has researched the tech for Volt. You can of course create your own clan instead of joining others, but it takes a lot of work and resources before you will be able to research for a Volt blueprint. You get all the blueprints from the Tenno lab in the clan dojo. It costs 35,000 credits to replicate the main blueprint and 15,000 credits for each of the chassis, neuroptics, and system blueprint. Now here is where I am going to give my own perspective of what a beginner would experience while playing each of the starter frames. And I will also show you how the endgame performance of Excalibur, Mag, and Volt looks like when you build it to its min-max potential, so that you will know what you are grinding for. But remember that there is no need to stick to one Warframe, as you can always switch between any of them at any time. In the beginning, Excalibur would seem lackluster. With no appropriate mods, your skills won't be at its best, just like all other Warframes. All you have is a slash dash, which helps give you temporary invulnerability, but you can't spam it. In the higher ranks, you'll be able to use crowd control skills of Blind, and an expensive area effect skill which diminishes its effectiveness the higher level enemies you encounter. Your best ability is the Exalted Blade, but with its constant drain of energy, you can't use it for very long in the early game. So all you have is a slightly tougher armor than Mag and Volt, but with no reliable way to regenerate health. In the endgame, however, Excalibur's Slash Dash and Radio Javelin becomes obsolete. They deal mediocre damage to enemies level 60 onwards because they are high armor value, but the Exalted Blade remains powerful and even sustainable to be always active if modded correctly. It is Excalibur's only ability that is effective against high level enemies. If you want to be a samurai that fires sonic boom projectiles by swinging a sword, Excalibur is your guy. Mag in the early game can have quite an easy life. Her first ability pool can deal damage, do crowd control, easy to aim, and even have a chance to be a free skill cast when it pulls out an energy orb from an enemy. The Magnetize ability is a longer duration stun that amplifies damage, making it ideal against tough to kill enemies. And you got two AoE abilities with Polarize and Crush to wipe the map if modded correctly. But Mag in the late game have very little use, which is why you will see that veterans will rarely play Mag if at all. There are ways to replenish energy by then. Crowd control is generally unnecessary because kills per minute takes precedence, and almost every other Warframe has some sort of massive area effect damage capabilities. Mag's greatest weakness in the late game is both her squishiness and the magnetic element damage her abilities deal, which is effective only against the Corpus faction that has shields. And generally, if your weapons and ability can destroy a Grineer, it can destroy a Corpus too. And lastly, Volt. Volt in the early game, it is debatable whether his utility kit is useful at all. His shock ability is clunky to use than Mag's pool, because it is easy to miss and result in wasted energy. Mag's pool can automatically target anyone in sight even through walls while Volt's shock can't. The enemies also need to be close together for shock to chain its effects. Volt's speed buff is a nice tool, but unless you are doing a speed run or travelling in the open world maps like Plains of Eidolon, it is not any much more superior to your normal bullet jump, which is the usual way to move around the map. Volt's electric shields are useful for its damage boosting ability aside from the protection it gives. As mentioned before, it is great for Eidolon boss fights, but to use as protection for defense mission targets, there are other Warframes that do a better job, like Frost and Limbo. His discharge is a great nuking ability until you reach around level 80 enemies and above. The damage starts to dwindle in the high levels when the armor value increases. So it's great for farming low levels, bad for the endgame. Alright, this video has gone on long enough and I will end it here. I hope this video has helped you decide better which starter frame to pick. Although the Warframe community would recommend you to pick Excalibur, while I would pick Mag if I would start a new account, ultimately you should pick whichever suits your preference best. What's important is to enjoy the game the way you want it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, share and subscribe. Void, signing out.